So welcome, Laurie Kaye, journalist, writer, broadcaster, producer, and as for the purposes of today, author of Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper, My Life Leading Up to John Lennon's Last Interview, which I've read, and I read it cover to cover in absolutely no time at all over the weekend. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it was really compelling, actually. As much your story and what was going on for you as the Beatles interest, which is going to be maybe part of the wider audience's point of view. I just found it fascinating. So thank you very much for your work.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad to hear that you enjoyed it. And let me show it to everybody.
Ta-da!
This is Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper,
There
my
you
life
go.
leading up to John Lennon's last interview. And it's the story of my rock radio related early life and career wrapped around what tragically turned out to be John
Yeah.
Lennon's last day on the planet and last interview, unfortunately, December 8th, 1980, which I was unbelievably able to spend a major part of with him and Yoko at the Dakota. And I felt like I'd begun to make lifetime friends. But sadly, of course, that couldn't really happen because John was shot and killed mere hours after our get together.
Wow.
Ugh.
Oh, unbelievable. Unbelievable. One, having read through the book, one thing that comes and is a consistent thread right the way throughout is music, and not just the music of the Beatles, but such a diverse range of music. Absolutely fantastic. And it's always interesting to hear somebody's point of view in terms of what they were listening to, with as much as what they were listening to. So you detail about you getting how important that first transistor radio was for you, and how you described your later hi-fi systems. It's interesting to hear how exactly you were listening to music. So is music still important to you now, Laurie?
Absolutely. Music changed my life when I was a toddler because it got me through being very, very young and realizing that I had a dysfunctional family and somewhat cruel, disinterested mother.
Yeah.
So I was able to concentrate completely on music. And before I had the transistor radio, I was able to listen to the radio. And my grandparents, who we lived with, listened to music on shows on television. Um, Everyone from Ella Fitzgerald
Yeah.
to my mother's love Frank Sinatra, who weren't necessarily my absolute favorites going through it. As a matter of fact, as a kid, I thought they introduced her as Elephant Gerald. I never got her name right. Um, but then when I realized that a transistor radio was possibly available and my grandparents got one for me, I listened to it all day and all night with the earplugs in my ears. Didn't have to talk to anybody. I could listen to everything from Elvis Presley to Little Richard to then the Beach Boys, and then, of course, eventually the Beatles.
The
And
Beatles.
it
Yeah.
was super cool. And now I still listen to the radio. I still listen, of course, to all of my vintage vinyl albums and everything else I have. And I go to as many live concerts as I can, even though they're incredibly expensive these days. It's
Absolutely.
still worth it to go see the Rolling Stones or the Steve Miller Band or
Yeah.
so many other contemporary bands that we like, my husband and I. So, yes, music is the major part of my life.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned just a second ago about your mother, and you certainly had a turbulent and complex relationship with her, over the years. But I got the feeling that it really developed an independent streak in you, and gave you a strength to really follow the path that you ended up following in terms of writing and radio.
Well, no doubt. My single, dysfunctional, violent mom, who I'm sad to say was never interested in any of my abilities, my talent, my intellect, my eventual career, she unfortunately blamed her pregnancy with me for the loss of her husband, who
Yeah.
left and divorced her and never returned. And of course, I never met my father, which made me somewhat similar to John Lennon's
Yeah,
family relationship as well.
very much so.
So, what that meant to me was I had to realize that when I did eventually write my memoir, I would talk about my mother and what she ended up doing to me, which is why, honestly, I didn't want to write my memoir while she was still with us, because even though I knew she wouldn't read it, I'm afraid people she knew would, and she would know she'd been insulted by me, and that would maybe have freaked her out. So I didn't want to do that.
Completely understandable as well. So if we jump back, I want to take us back to the Dakota building, and many people, many of us, I mean, me included, have been there and visited New York, and um, I guess paid homage to John by visiting, what was his home for it in his last years. But you are one of very few people to have actually gone inside, and I just wanted to just get your feelings on what your impressions were going in there for the first time. For it, it wasn't just a home for them, but it was also a working environment as well, I guess.
The Dakota was amazing to me, absolutely amazing, especially first seeing the interior of their private office, which was primarily Yoko's office because she did the work, but it was her and John's
Yeah.
all together. And that's where we were about to set up and get ready for our interview. Me and my co-interviewer, Dave Sholin, and
Hmm.
our producer and technical engineer Ron Hummel, and our record company guy Bert Keene. So everything there was great to check out from when we first walked in, and I saw this fuzzy white shag carpet, and it was amazing. It made me want to be barefoot. And
Yeah.
also the cool furniture that they had in there, which included a super long glass top coffee table that had metal snakes crawling, sliding up its legs. And I kept watching it all the way during our hours long interview. And when John came, he came and sat next to me on the love seat, which was right next to the table. And it was super comfortable for me to sit on. And then to have him sit next to me, it was amazing. I
How
spent
special.
hours sitting not even inches away from John Lennon. I felt like I was having the best dream of my life. So the Dakota was for me, like I said, amazing.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
I mean, name dropping, the term, I guess, name dropping can have a slightly negative connotation of, for those somebody who wanting to inflate their own status. But reading your book, I don't get that feeling at all. You're very humble and modest about all these people. I mean, every page there's a different name on it. So outside of those Beatle connection people that you came across, who are some of the other people that you came across, and who were your favorite interactions or and interviews particularly with?
Well, from the minute I started seeing, interviewing, and meeting up with rock stars who were my idols, and their producers, and their record company people, and the
Yeah.
radio DJs who loved them and introduced them to me, um, I started seriously becoming a rock and roll name dropper, especially when I was able to write radio specials and magazine articles about them.
Yeah.
And everyone from, as you mentioned, the Beatles, Paul McCartney with Linda and their latest lineup of Wings, and George Harrison, and of course, John Lennon, and their incredible producer, George Martin, and so many other great stars that I got to meet up with and interview. The Ramones, I was such a punk rocker at that point. I loved the Ramones, and I saw them so many times, so many different cities, so many different types of venues, everything from halls, major concert halls to bars, basically
Yeah,
small bars
yeah.
where they played standing and jumping up and down on a table. It was great. And also, I did one of the very first West Coast interviews with Talking Heads. They were incredible. And then years later, to be able to interview Richard Penniman, Little Richard,
Yeah.
who I've
Wow.
just been such an incredible fan of since I was a kid. He was a great interview, and it was so much fun to write about that interview for Rock Magazine. And also Grace Slick, who I interviewed quite a few and hung out with quite a few times
Wow.
with at KFRC in San Francisco. Her band membership and everything. But then when she was pretty much solo, years later, I got to interview her also for Rock Magazine, and that was a great article too. So many incredible interviews and specials that I did. I can't even name them all because there's so many. And then years later, when I was doing the production and interviews for Metalhead, which was BMG's
Yeah.
music video magazine, and Slammin', their rap and R&B one, and Country Music Video Magazine, which I not only created but also produced and did a lot of interviews with in Nashville. Everyone from Garth Brooks to Marty Stewart to you name it. It never stopped. They were
Yeah.
incredible. I loved doing so many interviews. And
That's
Barry Manilow. I loved interviewing Barry
fun.
Manilow too. He was just surprisingly cool. And yeah, and if I were still doing rock star interviews today, I would still be name dropping.
Yep.
And I still name drop just saying I went to concerts. So
Yeah.
it's exciting.
You mentioned concerts, and again, live music is dotted throughout your story. Um, I know that you mentioned them several times, the Ramones, but what are some of your favorite gigs that you've been to in terms of, maybe more intricate, smaller venues, or some of the bigger stadium shows? Who have you enjoyed seeing the most?
Well, in terms of being able to talk about it to this day, I'm thrilled to be able to tell people that I saw the Beatles,
Yeah.
one of the last US shows ever at Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles. And I was a kid, and I was invited to go by the mother of a friend of mine whose daughter was having a birthday party. And so
Uh-huh.
she took several of us to the show. Unfortunately, there was a lot of screaming and everybody was standing, and our seats were way up at the top of the baseball stadium. And so, unfortunately, couldn't hear that much, couldn't see that much,
Yeah.
remember that much, but I'm still thrilled at having been there. And in terms of some of my favorite shows over the years, wow, David Bowie's one of his last Ziggy Stardust tour shows.
Wow.
It was just so amazing for me. I had just fallen in love with his music on the radio, and also listening to the albums that I had already. And it was so cool to see him. He not only was an amazing performer, but he was an amazing dresser. And it was so cool because he got to sing for the first time in one of these shows, Jean Genie, which he had just
Okay.
recorded,
Yeah.
and immediately became my favorite David Bowie song, and still is to this day. I play it all the time, and when I hear it, I have to jump up and dance and
Yeah.
get excited and everything.
I
And another favorite, extremely cool concert I went to was one that I won tickets to.
uh-huh.
As I talk about a lot in my book in a full chapter on KMET FM, I not only won albums and opportunity to talk to DJs, which was very exciting for me while I was
Sure.
in high school, but I won front row tickets to the Rolling Stones Nicaragua benefit at the Forum here in LA. And I had never seen the Stones before. And it was amazing, especially because Mick Jagger was deciding to dress like David Bowie. And so he had amazing costumes on. And the friend that I brought as my date,
Yeah.
great pictures. And I still have them to this day. So it's so cool to look at. And I've seen the Rolling Stones so many times since, including a few years back at the Rose Bowl, which is a
Okay.
giant football stadium,
Yeah, yeah,
basically.
yeah.
And but the Stones were great, and it was before they lost their original drummer, of
Yeah,
course, which was
yeah.
sad since. So that's why I haven't seen them since their most recent concert. And that was great. And so many concerts that I see these days are great. Steve Miller Band was
Mm,
amazing. Got to see them. And I can't help it sometimes singing along at a concert. And of course, I had to sing along to their song, Joker,
yeah,
because
the joke. Fantastic track.
yeah, exactly. It was amazing. So all those shows are great. Still are, still always will be. It's so cool to be able to see vintage bands and artists as well as contemporary ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I saw Springsteen, Bruce Springsteen, a couple of weeks ago, and for a guy who's 74, still puts on such an amazing show. Amazing show.
Very long, no doubt.
Yeah,
He always did extremely long ones.
yeah.
Every time I saw him in LA, San Francisco, Seattle, um, which was always surprising to me. So, but cool. I'm glad to hear he's still great.
He's still doing a good show. So,
Awesome.
if we can we touch on your interactions and your interviews that you did with George and Paul, because I think I'm right in saying that they were slightly different. George was on the phone. Was it a phone interview? And
Yes,
the Paul one was it in his London office?
yes.
Yeah.
George was a lengthy phone interview,
Okay.
primarily because two reasons. We had a show coming up that I was writing for RKO and Drake Chenault called The Top 100 of the 70s.
Yep.
And of course, George was going to appear in that. And then also, we were expanding the original Beatles special I wrote, which
Yeah.
was originally called RKO Presents the Beatles. And it was 14 hours long. And released to RKO radio stations
Wow.
on
Yeah.
reel to reel. And now it was going to be expanded, which it was to 17 hours, and syndicated internationally. And we got to change the name to the title that I'd come up with in the first place, which was The Beatles from Liverpool to Legend, which
Yeah.
I
Fantastic
really
title.
loved. So
Yeah.
I was able to use new George quotes for that too. So that was really great to do. And when that went out, it was released on vinyl albums instead of reel to reels. So that,
Okay.
and George just talked about amazing things, especially having just gotten married to Olivia and
Yep.
having just become a dad, which was very cool for him because not only did he love his son Danny, but he loved staying home and gardening. That
Yeah.
was his major love of life back then. And when I asked him about his album and what he was going to call it, that was just about to come out, he said, "Nah, I'm not going to give it a title because people go in and ask in stores for George Harrison's latest album anyway. So we'll just call it George Harrison." Which he did, and that was exciting to hear. And he wasn't eager to go out on tour at all because he wanted to stay home with his wife, with his son, and with his garden. He was very excited to. And then that was, I believe, December 1978. And then in June of 1979, I was asked by Dave Sholin, who was also my co-interviewer of John
Hmm.
Lennon, to come to London with him and Ron, our engineer,
Yeah.
producer, to interview Paul and Linda McCartney and their latest lineup of Wings, which of course included the recently late, great Denny Lane.
Jenny Lane. Mm-hmm.
And that was an amazing interview as well. And not only because I always thought Paul was incredibly cute and just obviously loved his wife so much, but it was just so touching to hang out with him and see him and get kissed by him and hugged by him. And Linda and Paul gave me things. He gave me a copy of a song that I loved, which was Silly Love Songs. And
Uh-huh.
he, Linda, and Denny all signed it lovingly for me. And I still have it and I still show it off because
Why
it's
not?
amazing to me. And I'm never, ever, ever going to give it away or sell it or anything because I like to brag about it. It's part of my name dropping.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that was an amazing interview as well.
So, and you mentioned there Liverpool to Legend, and this was it? Did it go to 17 hours or something?
Yes, it
Yeah,
was expanded. We expanded it from 14 to 17 hours, which meant lots more late nights of me writing,
yeah.
which meant that I was working during the day in the newsroom as the news editor at
And this
KFR.
was a syndicated radio show,
Yeah,
essentially, wasn't
and
it?
all night I stayed up to write more of the show and do more interviews that needed to be done, and it was just incredible. Worked all weekend as well. So that's probably the coolest and most famous radio special I've written. That and John Lennon, The Man, the Memory, which was the show I
Sure.
wrote right after he was shot and killed. It was a 3-hour show that used a lot of our lengthy interview.
Interview, sure, sure. Are there any plans, or is Liverpool to Legend available in any format for people to listen to?
Well, that's really hard to say because RKO Radio doesn't exist anymore, the
Okay,
network. And everything that we did for them went and was sold along with the RKO Radio Network name to another company. So technically, it can't legally be released
right.
till that happens.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that there aren't parts of it on YouTube that people put there illegally, and I shouldn't
Mm-hmm.
mention it, but yes, it's an incredible special. I mean, I
Yeah.
still listen to part of it a lot of times and love listening to it and think to myself, wow, how did I ever write all that? Because the interesting thing is, so many books are written by people who are incredible Beatles experts, as well as book writing experts.
Yeah.
And I wasn't a Beatles expert. I had to do a lot of finding out about them and reading other people's books at the time before I started writing and
Sure.
became really knowledgeable. But basically having interviews to listen to that had been done for RKO stations back in the 60s when the Beatles first came was even more helpful than reading other people's books.
Sure.
So it was
Yeah,
very cool.
absolutely. And how important do you think that series was to your future career? I mean, do you think it was a direct link to you getting the interviews with Paul and John?
Absolutely. And the fact that the show itself was so well accepted, not just by all the executives at RKO and all the other radio companies, but to reviewers and listeners, and everybody just loved it. So that made me feel good. And people who still have it or listen to it today give me the same kind of compliments. So yes, that definitely expanded my career and made it possible for me to be asked to go to London to do the Paul McCartney interview,
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
New York be the only radio team to go talk to John and Yoko once Double Fantasy was about to be released. So it was very exciting and changed my career. And the sad thing was, as I talked about my mother not being interested in my career or
Sure.
my experience or my abilities, even though I told her when it was going to be on in LA when it first came out, she said, no, I don't really have the time to listen to it. And I've never been a Beatles fan. And, if you'd written about Frank Sinatra, that would be different. And,
Such a
it's just,
shame.
yeah, too bad. Typical
Can,
though.
can I ask you about Yoko? Because you had went on December the 8th when you were interviewing John and Yoko. The first part of the interview session was just with Yoko. So I'd just like to get your take on what were your impressions of her as a person at that point in time, and what are your impressions of her now since she's managed, she's brought up Sean in very testing circumstances, and she's managing the legacy of John. So what are your impressions of Yoko now, having time passed?
Well, starting on our December 8th interview, Yoko came down to talk to us before John did because he
Mm,
was still up finishing the photo session. And she was super excited to see me, not only because I was the only woman there, and
yeah.
so she felt something in common, but also because she was excited. I brought my copy of her incredible book, Grapefruit. And so she immediately looked at it and started opening up all the pages and everything and being so thrilled because she said she hadn't seen a copy of this edition in years and years. And she knew she and John were going to want to sign it for me,
Oh,
which
that's
they did.
fantastic.
And it appears in my
And
book
there it
because
is.
I put their signatures, this page in my book, so people can pretend that they got a signature from John and Yoko too. And so I felt like Yoko immediately became my friend. She was super friendly, sweet, and informative. And not just because, like I said, we were the only females in our group, but also because they were thrilled, John, when he came down also, but Yoko, to see that I brought a present for Sean, which was a wind up metal um, dragon toy that basically breathed fire. And she was so excited. And she said, oh my God, when John sees this and plays with it, he's going to wonder if he wants to give it to Sean. He'll think we should keep it and play with it ourselves. And she was right, because when John came down and ended up playing with it and
Sure
winding it
enough.
up and letting it go up and down the coffee table in front of us, that was exactly his thought. He wasn't sure he was going to give it to Sean. And of course, because he was killed right after our interview, I never knew that Yoko would have given it to Sean, because maybe it would have made him feel bad. And because I never had any contact with Sean after all these years, those years, 40 plus years, there was no way I could ask him. But then finally, just a couple months ago, I got to meet Sean and
Oh,
talk at the screening of his animated film, War is Over.
war is over. Uh-huh.
Yeah. And I got to tell him, I'm Laurie Kaye, the one who did the last interview with your father.
Yeah.
And I got to sign my book for him and give it to him. And he was going to read it. He was excited. And I said, and I have to ask you, by any chance, did your mother give you the toy that I brought for you? And he looked at me and he said, I think I know what toy it was. Tell me. And I said, the wind up fire breathing dragon. And he said, oh my God, yes, that was my favorite toy as a kid. And I was so thrilled and so happy to hear that. It made me feel so good about that one little thing that I did for Sean. And I feel like we became friends. I hope I
Yeah.
get to talk to him again and
How
meet
special.
him again. And
How special.
it's what's exciting to me
Yeah.
that Yoko is still, of course, very close to and very, very excited about being Sean's mother,
Yeah.
and loves, still discussing John and everything. And she's just a wonderful woman. And I wish I had contact with her still to this day. Unfortunately, I don't, but who knows? Maybe someday I will get to.
Well, fingers crossed. Let's hope that comes to pass.
Yes.
You obviously have, and in virtually everything you've done in your career, it's been uh, a very discernible love of writing. So, how easy do you find it to write?
Well, that's a good question because writing for me is easy when it comes to taking an interview and turning it into an article or
Sure.
a radio special. I absolutely love writing, but in terms of doing my memoir,
Yeah.
writing about me, that's harder. That's
Mm,
a lot harder. And something I realized while even considering writing my memoir was that unless you've kept a daily diary and written down what goes on in your life every day of the year,
yeah.
which fortunately I never did, lifetime memories can be really hard to come back to, especially the older you get, like me. Plus, if you're not a celebrity, which I'm not, getting a literary agent and publisher eventually interested in your memoir and having you write it can also be extremely difficult unless you're willing to self-publish, which I never was. So
Yeah.
lucky for me, I was able to work it out and find a traditional independent publishing company that was super eager to read my self-published edited my self-edited, not self-published first draft and send me a contract right away to publish my book. Yay. But still, there are a number of reasons it took me nearly 40 years, almost 4 decades, since
Yeah.
the afternoon I spent with John and Yoko to even begin writing all about my entire life up to, during, and yes, even beyond that point. Not only was I feeling much too miserable and, yes, extremely guilty to sit down and put together my story on paper, but I was also concerned about embarrassing my mother, as I said, since I
Hmm.
knew I'd need to truthfully describe her decayed single mom treatment of me throughout my childhood and my teen years, and also as an adult. I was also far too busy contemplating and slowly but surely coordinating my upcoming career changes since I felt the need to leave radio and make the move from on air to print and then eventually over to TV and video writing and production. And my freelance and far beyond full time gigs kept me wrapped up multiple hours of each and every day and night of the week. So
Imagine.
sadly, I had no time or energy to even think about concentrating on or coming up with my book right off the bat. And this was despite the fact that, as I say in my introductory first chapter, which I eventually started writing in 2020, following both my mother's passing and thanks to the pandemic, pretty much putting my TV production work to a complete close. Whenever
Yeah.
anyone found out over the years that our RKO team had conducted John Lennon's final interview, jaws dropped, people gasped, and the inevitable question was asked, Laurie, when are you going to write your book? And finally, I was able to answer, now. So that's the one good thing about COVID. It gave me the
It
opportunity to
gave you
write
the
it.
chance.
And believe it or not, the coolest comment that ever convinced me to write my memoir actually came from John Lennon himself at the tail end of our interview. After he begged me to let him autograph along with Yoko Ono the copy of her great book Grapefruit, which I brought to the Dakota with me, and they were super excited since they hadn't seen it in years. I said, of course, and I thanked him profusely. He was thrilled to be able to sign it for me since he'd written Grapefruit's introduction
Yeah.
of that edition. And when I told him how grateful I was, he made a point of telling me how much he himself loved it when authors signed their books for him. So I, of course, told him that when I wrote mine, eventually, I'd definitely send him an autographed copy. And he smiled at me like crazy and said, "Great," which made me feel even more than great, even decades later.
Can I just ask you about going back to music again? Because um, you mentioned loads of different varieties of music that you've been into over the years, and you've been exposed to, rock and roll and pop and reggae, and a huge chunk of punk in there as well, I think. Um, how important do you think it is to have a wide variety of music in your life?
Extremely. And that was one of the coolest things about working in radio stations.
Absolutely.
Even though they were AM rock and roll stations, they of course played great pop. Some of them even played country and passed it over. And a lot of them played heavy metal, which was so cool because that's how I got introduced to AC/DC, which became one of my favorite bands of all times. And I wish I could see them live again. That would be so cool. So I'm hoping that they'll eventually do more shows. And, who knows, maybe they will, maybe they won't. And then, of course, I had boyfriends who really even made me more excited and more familiar with blues and blues artists and
Yeah.
reggae. And then when I started doing the BMG music video magazines, back in the late 80s and early 90s, and created the Country Music Video Magazine, it was super thrilling because country, especially in 1990, started just not changing as much as just improving and just having so many more great artists
Yeah.
that were so exciting to me, and also so rock oriented as well. Everyone from Marty Stewart to even Garth Brooks. And it was just wonderful to be able to talk to them all and listen to their music on albums and DVDs, and to see them live and to interview them and talk to them. So I loved country, and still do, not quite as much as I did back then, but it's it's more exciting for me now to, as I mentioned before, see my original favorite rock bands as
Yeah.
many times as I can. And there are so many, like I said, I wish I could see again. Everyone from AC/DC to the Kinks, who were just amazing live. And it just breaks my heart that they haven't done more shows.
The Kinks were the first band I ever saw.
Wow.
So radio is such an important feature in your life, both listening to it as well as working in it. What do you think the state of radio is now? Is it as important as it was in the past? And what do you think the future holds for radio?
Well, I think it's as important, but I don't think other people do, to be
Mm,
honest, because one of the major ways I listened to radio was sitting at home and keeping my radio on, or
sure.
when I was in a car driving or being a passenger or whatever. But now people listen to podcasts as much or whatever. So I understand that that's as important. But what made radio so incredibly important for me right from the start was listening to the AM stations when I was a little kid, and
Yeah.
then breaking into KMET FM, which was an amazing LA station that played so many artists to me for the first time, hearing everyone from David Bowie to so many more. And it was so exciting for me. And then starting to win things on the air, and I won those Rolling Stones Nicaragua benefit concert tickets. And when I went to the radio station to pick up the tickets, I was told that the disc jockey on the air, who was one of my favorites, wanted me to come on the air with him so he could
Uh-huh.
introduce me to his listening audience. And it was my favorite KMET FM DJ, B. Mitchell Reed, otherwise
Uh-huh.
known as
Okay.
Beamer, who asked my name and my age and congratulated me. And then he said, And Laurie, with your voice, you should consider an on-air radio career. Start thinking about it. So, of course, I immediately did. He changed my life, and he's the main reason that I ended up working in radio
There you
instead
have
of
it.
going from journalism school at UC Berkeley to doing newspaper jobs in print.
Yep.
I started in radio, and it was great.
There you go. Can I speak to you about John and the interview on December the 8th? You were in a very privileged position to be not just in the same room as him, but he came in and sat right beside you and looked you right in the eye. What person did you see when you looked back and looked in his face?
I saw the intellectual that I was just so excited, not just to be sitting next to, but to be near and to be able to talk to. Because even though we were told, don't talk about the Beatles, don't ask John about his past. This is all about going forward and the new music that he's created with Yoko and all of that.
Yeah,
I was still so very excited because John brought a lot of it up himself.
sure.
And when we started talking, the guys, Dave Sholin and our record company guy, Bert Keane, brought up John's son, Sean Lennon, and family life because Dave was married and Bert had a son the same age. And even though I had no family life I necessarily wanted to remember, and certainly wasn't in a relationship or married or thought of having children, I listened to it and it was interesting. But it went on for quite a while. And I was really surprised that John didn't say something. And finally, I just looked at him and I said, John, I want to ask you about getting the urge to make music again. And John burst in with his super loud, funny, and affectionate reply and saying, oh, it came over me all of a sudden, love. I didn't know what came over me. And it's definitely about time to start talking about my music with Yoko. And, you know, we'll leave the family life for later.
Yeah.
And I said, great. And everyone laughed while I reacted confidently to his endearing response. I said, I know, it's like you were possessed. And he says, yes, I was possessed by this rock and roll devil, you know? And that was just so funny. I couldn't stop laughing, and neither could anybody else. And he asked me, was that your question? Did I interrupt you? And I said, no, you got it. And I told him that, smiling like crazy as he and Yoko both went on to discuss their work and the love that went into creating Double Fantasy, the love between the two of them and the love that they wanted to see happening between other male and female couples all over the
Yeah.
world. And it was really funny because he went on to say, Laurie, just suddenly I had, like, if you'll pardon the expression, the diarrhea of creativity. And that, of course, made me laugh and laugh and laugh. And he went on and talked more
You
about his music.
That's fantastic. And you've described that day as being both the best and also the worst day of your life. So now 40 plus years have now passed. How do you reflect now on that day? And if you hear songs from Double Fantasy now, how do you feel when you hear those songs on the radio or whatever?
Well, I play Double Fantasy a lot.
Okay,
I
good.
still have my record player and the original autographed album from John. And
Of course.
of course, I play it. And the interesting thing is that I still consider December 8th, 1980, and always will, to be the worst and best day of my life. And this is going to be the 44th anniversary this year of
Yeah.
John's last day on the planet and his last interview, which of course I co-conducted for RKO Radio at the Dakota with him and Yoko. And the thing is it was the best day because I finally got to meet up with my idol. It was just amazing. And I never really thought that I'd ever had a chance to do it. But I did. And of course, it was the worst day of my life because mere hours after the tail end of our interview, he was shot and killed. And finding out about it just horrified me and made me feel automatically guilty. And I still feel guilty, even though for nearly 44 years, I've tried almost every day to stop feeling guilty and to stop blaming myself. But in a way, I can't help it. There's almost nothing I can do.
It's a rare situation, I guess, that once you've read a book that you actually get to speak to the author. And I'm privileged in being able to speak to you now. But as I read that book, and at the end, you do allude to the fact that you've carried this guilt after that day and your interaction, particularly with the interaction with his murderer shortly after, which is horrific. But I just, I really just wanted to say to you that please don't feel guilty anymore.
I
Uh,
try not to, but thanks to my meetup with that creep, who I never mention his name, and I
mm,
never let anybody say his name to me because I don't want to give him the publicity that he was trying to get.
yeah,
Um, but thanks to my awful meetup with him, um, he he begged to talk to me and bugged me and followed me after the interview ended and I came out of the Dakota, and he kept saying, "Did you talk to him? Did you get his autograph? What did he say? Did you talk to him? Did you get his autograph?" He kept repeating it over and over. And then after the guys left and John and Yoko left, he started bugging me again and following me up and down the sidewalk. And I wanted to get rid of him. I wanted to smack him, but I couldn't do that. I don't do those kind of things. And I still feel guilty to this day for not letting the Dakota Security Department know that he was somebody who should be removed from in front of their building. And maybe they would have called the police, who would have come and gotten him and taken him away. Or maybe either of them, the security department team or the police, would have noticed, which I didn't, that he had a gun that he was
yeah.
carrying in his pocket that he was going to shoot and kill John with. So, of course, I feel guilty about that. And I also feel guilty because before the date of the interview was determined, um, Yoko had her astrologer call me and the other guys who were going with me to ask our birthday and not just date of birth, but time of birth and other
Yeah.
questions,
Uh-huh.
determine what would be the best day to schedule the interview. And it was just so weird because how could the best interview date have been come up as December 8th, 1980? It just it just doesn't make sense because John and Yoko were supposed to be in Hawaii and on the West Coast during that week. But
Yep.
thanks to my birthday and their birthdays, they stayed in New York and got interviewed, and John got shot and killed. So that contributes to my guilt feeling as well.
So when you do listen to Double Fantasy now, does it give you, what feelings do you get from listening to that music now? Is it are you uplifted, or do you feel wistful and sad about the situation?
Well, I love the songs, but also it partly makes me cry
Mm,
because I think about talking about the songs and hearing both John and Yoko talk about how they wrote them, how John sent his copy of songs he wrote to Yoko, and Yoko's response with her uh, songs that she wrote that she sent to John, and going back and forth. And then their talk about loving recording them together and how they were considering going on tour together and with their musicians that they recorded with. And I badly wanted to see them if they were going to do that. But of course, sadly, that was never able to happen.
I guess one thing that you can take away from the interviews you've done with not just John, but with Paul and with George, is that at that moment in time, they were probably as happy as they ever were. I mean, John was really positive at that point and looking forward. Paul was in a pretty good place in 78 and 79. George has just got married and had his first kid. So really positive times that you were privileged to interview them at that point in time.
Yeah, it bums me out, of course, that I never got to interview Ringo, although I did see him very recently, July
Uh-huh.
7th, his birthday.
Yeah.
He had a gathering here in Beverly Hills. And even though I wasn't an especially invited guest, I did get to see and wave at him and leave a member of his staff with a copy of my book that I autographed.
Okay.
So hopefully he'll read that and see it. And maybe someday I will get to meet and talk to him. Who knows? And
Maybe.
it was also very exciting to get to interview George Martin, their incredible producer,
Yeah.
because his book had just come out. All You Need Is Ears.
Ears.
And he
Yeah.
said just loving, wonderful things about the Beatles and working with them. And it was great hearing his memories about all that. And that was in early 1980. So I've had a lot of great experiences thanks to the Beatles, those former
Absolutely.
Fab Four members and their producers.
So I guess as we draw to a close, I just want to ask you, what's next for Laurie Kaye? I mean, is there another book in the offing? What can we look forward to?
Well, book promotion is a
Okay.
full-time job and plus right now. I not only have another book launch and signing coming up at a major store, Barnes and Noble, uh,
Okay. Yeah.
in Santa Monica here, and that's the company that owns what's it called, Waterstone,
Waterstones. Yep.
yeah,
Hmm.
in the UK, and they carry my book, and it's especially popular at the Liverpool store, which
I
I'm
bet.
happy to hear from its manager, who carries it in stock in both the Beatles sections and the general entertainment section of his store. But I also did the New York Fest for Beatles fans earlier this year, and I do live readings all the time. And I have another book festival coming up in November, and then I'll be doing another one, a New York Fest for Beatles fans, early next year. And so there's just so many things. Plus, I do a lot of podcast and print and website and blog interviews. And what I really want is for readers to love my book so much that they want to review it for me too. And hopefully on Amazon or one of their bookstore websites, because it's
Yep.
available on so many of those. So a 5-star book review would really help promote my book and make my more than full-time job even
Well,
better.
I'll be heading up to Liverpool in a couple of weeks, so I'll make sure I pop into Waterstones and make sure your book is prominently displayed.
Oh, it is. I have a picture of it on the shelves. So cool.
And obviously, I'll put links to to more details on your website and where people can purchase the book um, in the foot of the description, so people will be able to get the details there. But Laurie, thank you ever so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed chatting with you. I love the book, and I really appreciate you spending some time with us today.
My pleasure. I hope everybody who hears about my book reads it also. Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper, my life leading up to John Lennon's last interview, is there for you to read, whether you get it on Amazon or Amazon UK or anywhere else in the world, and bunches of bookstores and bunches of websites. And thank you so much for helping me promote it and for giving me a great oral review. I hope you'll give me a great written review too.
It will be coming very soon. Laurie,
Thank
thank you ever so much.
Thank you. Pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.